She didn't scream. They expected her to, alone, forgotten, and fading into the shadows of a court that had once called her Queen Anne of Cleves, met her end not with fire or blade, but with something colder, something quieter. A death that didn't make the history books bleed, but still haunted the stones of Havre and Chelsea. No executioner raised a sword, no crowd gasped as blood hit the scaffold. Instead, her final moments passed in silence, so silent, in fact, that even time seemed to forget her. But how did this woman, once married to the most dangerous king in England, vanish so completely from the story? She was not beheaded like Anne Boleyn. She was not poisoned like some whisper. And yet the fate that befell Anne of Cleves may be the most terrifying of all, not because it was loud, but because it was invisible. Who was this fourth wife of Henry VIII? Why did he reject her, humiliate her, then seemingly let her live, only for history to bury her deeper than those he killed? This isn't a tale of love. It's a tale of exile, silence, and slow undoing. And once you know how it ends, you'll understand why her story was never meant to be told. England in the year 1539 was a kingdom on edge. Henry VIII had torn his nation away from the Roman Catholic Church just 5 years earlier, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. The split had set fire to Europe, enraging Catholic powers like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Inside England, religious and political factions clashed like tectonic plates, each one hoping the next queen might tilt the balance in their favor. The king had already cycled through 3 wives. His first, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast aside. His second, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded. His third, Jane Seymour, died giving him a son. Now Henry was aging, bloated, paranoid, and desperate to secure England's future through diplomacy and heirs. That's where Anne of Cleves enters. She was born in 1515 in the small German duchy of Cleves. Her brother the Duke had embraced Protestantism and sought alliances with other reform-minded rulers. England, isolated and increasingly threatened by Catholic enemies, seemed like a perfect match. But Anne wasn't chosen by Henry himself. She was chosen through a portrait. The famed court painter Hans Holbein the Younger was sent to Cleves to paint Anne and her sister. When Henry saw the painting, he approved, charmed by her graceful pose and supposed beauty. It was diplomacy by canvas, and the marriage was arranged before he'd ever laid eyes on her. Anne, who had never been to England or met its volatile king, sailed across the Channel in the dead of winter. She came not as a lover, but as a symbol of peace, of alliance, of Protestant unity. But when Henry met her in person, everything changed. Accounts differ on why exactly he recoiled. Some say he was offended by her plainness. Others blame her manner. Anne was raised in a strict court where flirtation was frowned upon. She didn't respond to Henry's theatrical courtship, and he, ever the narcissist, took it as rejection. He would later call her the Flanders Mare, and yet the marriage proceeded. Henry was trapped by politics. Backing out would insult the Protestant German states, possibly pushing them into the arms of Catholic powers. For 6 weeks, Anne and Henry lived together as husband and wife in name only. No consummation, no warmth, it's just ceremony. Behind the scenes, Henry plotted an escape. His advisors scrambled to find a loophole, a justification for annulment. They claimed the marriage was invalid because Henry hadn't willingly agreed, and because Anne had supposedly not been a virgin. The charges were baseless. But the wheels of royal decree were already turning. In July 1540, just 6 months after their wedding, the marriage was declared null. Anne, now just 25, had been married, rejected, and discarded by the most powerful man in the realm. But unlike her predecessors, she wasn't sent to the scaffold. Instead, she was given a pension, several estates, and a new title, the king's beloved sister. It sounded generous, it looked merciful, and to many it seemed Anne of Cleves had escaped the fate of Henry's other wives. But what did that title truly mean, and what price did she pay to wear it? Her real punishment hadn't begun yet. Anne had survived what so many others hadn't: the king's rejection. But survival in Tudor England was never just about avoiding the axe. It was about power or the loss of it. And Anne of Cleves had just lost everything that made her matter in Henry's world. At court, her title, the king's beloved sister, was more insult than honor. She had no real power, no influence, no family to protect her. She could no longer return to Cleves without shaming her brother's house, and she wasn't welcomed in England as a true royal either. She floated somewhere between exile and limbo, a living reminder of Henry's humiliation. Everyone smiled at her. No one trusted her, and yet Henry kept her close. He gave her lands, jewels, and money. She appeared in royal pageants and dined at court. But behind the golden gowns was something colder: control. Henry didn't reward her, he contained her. Every move Anne made was watched, every letter read, every conversation weighed against loyalty. She was not a prisoner in chains, but a prisoner in silk. Things grew more complicated with time. In July 1540, just weeks after Anne's annulment, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a girl of just 17. Young, flirtatious, and full of courtly charm, Catherine was everything Anne was not. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Anne, now living at Richmond, was left to hear about the new queen's every ball, every dress, every whisper of affection from the king. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Anne still harbored hopes of being reinstated as queen if Catherine failed, and fail she did. Less than 2 years into her marriage, Catherine was charged with adultery. The evidence letters meeting's lovers was damning. In February 1542, she was executed at the Tower. For a brief moment, eyes turned again toward Anne. Would Henry take her back? It would have made sense. She was still unmarried, still noble, still politically valuable. She had shown no disloyalty, and was even said to have mourned Catherine's downfall. But when asked if she'd return to the role of Queen Anne, remained diplomatic, praising the king, offering her service, but never directly pushing for the crown. Some say she hoped Henry would choose her of his own will. Others believe she feared what might happen if she returned to the throne and failed a second time. But Henry had already moved on. By July 1543, he married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Intelligent and politically savvy, Parr was no beauty, but she knew how to survive Henry's wrath. Anne was now permanently relegated to the edges of court, a guest in the country she once thought might become her home, and yet she endured. Unlike most women at court, Anne avoided scandal. She remained dutiful, religious, and loyal to the king, even appearing at court events to show support for his new queen. Outwardly, she played the part perfectly, but inwardly the cracks had begun to show. Her income was slowly reduced. Her estates were harder to maintain. She lost influence with each passing year, especially after Henry's death in 1547. Under Edward VI, His Protestant heir, Anne, was tolerated, but she had no real allies left in the Regency Council and no voice in the decisions being made. And then came Mary. In 1553, Mary I ascended the throne, a staunch Catholic and daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary saw Anne as a symbol of Protestant failure. Anne had supported Mary's claim during the brief and chaotic rule of Lady Jane Grey, but it wasn't enough. Once again, Anne found herself on the outside, looking in excluded from court festivities and viewed with suspicion. She was no longer valuable. She was simply inconvenient. She spent her final years largely in seclusion, first at Hever Castle, then at Chelsea Old Manor. Once surrounded by servants and splendor, Anne now lived with a skeleton staff. Her health began to fail, and with it, her place in the world shrank. There were no dramatic arrests, no show trials, no executions. But that made it no less tragic. Anne of Cleves didn't die in one day. She died slowly, faded out of relevance, erased from memory, and buried beneath layers of history that never quite knew what to do with her. A forgotten queen, a silent exile, a woman whose tragedy lay not in how she died, but in how quietly she vanished. And when the end finally came, it came not with horror, but with quiet horror. It began with stomach pain. At first, no one thought much of it. Anne had long suffered bouts of poor health fatigue, body aches, headaches. But in the summer of 1557, those around her began to notice she was no longer recovering. Her appetite faded. She grew thinner, weaker, quieter. There were no physicians rushing to her bedside, no royal proclamations announcing concern. Anne of Cleves, once Queen of England, now lay in Chelsea Old Manor, largely unseen and mostly forgotten. The official reports would later attribute her illness to a decline or natural causes. But even that phrasing, a decline, feels like a cruel joke. Anne had been declining for years, in reputation, in influence, in meaning, and now finally in body. She was 41, not old by Tudor standards, but for a woman discarded by the throne and left to live out her days in isolation, it was an eternity. In her final days, the room around her shrank. The sounds of court faded. The world outside continued, but within those manor walls, Anne slipped away bit by bit, breath by breath. She left no famous last words, no letters of spiritual courage like Catherine of Aragon, no speeches to her ladies like Anne Boleyn, no tearful goodbyes to children, for she had none. What she had was silence, and yet in that silence there was a different kind of scream, a scream history never bothered to hear. Because unlike the wives who were martyred or vilified, Anne of Cleves left behind no myth, no villainy, no tragedy so dramatic it demanded retelling. She left behind only a question: what becomes of the woman who survives Henry VIII? Some say survival is victory. But what if it's just a different kind of sentence? Anne's death on July 16th, 1557, was not marked by ceremony. She died quietly, perhaps, with a handful of attendants at her side. Perhaps not even that. There are no records of great mourning, no lavish processions like those granted to queens who bore kings' sons, no public outpouring of grief. But her death did mark one eerie distinction. She was the last of Henry's 6 wives to die. The one he never touched, the one he rejected, the one he spared. And in a strange twist of fate, she outlived them all. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, not among kings or queens, but in a modest tomb in a side chapel. Her monument is small, her epitaph brief. Visitors walk past it every day, unaware that behind the worn stone lies the only wife of Henry VIII, to escape his wrath, yet never escape his shadow. There are no legends of ghosts in the tower for Anne, no cursed portraits or whispered hauntings. But that doesn't make her death any less haunting. In many ways, it's worse. Because what killed Anne of Cleves wasn't poison or politics, it was erasure, the slow, creeping realization that she had become irrelevant, that her name, once on the lips of Europe's courts, now stirred no interest, no fear, no affection. She died not with violence, but with absence, and perhaps that's the most terrifying death of all. When Anne of Cleves died, England barely noticed. No poems were written, no ballads sung, no mourners lined the streets as they had for Jane Seymour, who died giving Henry his only son. No controversy echoed through the court like the fall of Catherine Howard. Anne simply slipped into the earth, and history closed its pages around her. And yet something of her remains, just not where you'd expect. There is no grand portrait of Anne among the royal halls. The famous Holbein painting that first won her the crown still hangs in a gallery, but few connect it to the life that followed. When visitors pass her tomb in Westminster Abbey, they rarely stop. The inscription is faded, her story unspoken, but in that silence lies a different kind of legacy. Anne of Cleves became a symbol, not of passion or betrayal, but of survival. In a reign defined by beheadings, miscarriages, and political games played in blood, she endured by choosing a quieter path. She played by the rules Henry gave her, and in doing so, outlived them all. There are some who argue she was the smartest of his wives. She made no enemies. She demanded nothing. She accepted humiliation, not as weakness, but as strategy. In a world where women who spoke out often lost their heads, Anne kept hers by remaining still, not passive, but precise. She understood her moment in history, and she played it just well enough to keep breathing. And yet, what does it say about us that we forget the one who lived? We remember the firebrands, the martyrs, the dramatic downfalls. We repeat the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But when we reach the final word survived, we don't say her name. We just move on. Anne's legacy is not carved into history the way others are, but it echoes in a quieter way. She reminds us that survival comes at a cost, that a life spared is not always a life fulfilled, that to live in the shadow of a tyrant, even without chains, can still feel like a prison. Perhaps that's why her story has returned centuries later, not as a tale of triumph, but as a cautionary silence. She may have died without violence, but she deserves to be remembered with weight. Because in a court that devoured women for being too loud, too proud, or simply too inconvenient, Anne of Cleves stood at the edge and quietly refused to fall. She wasn't the most beautiful. She wasn't the most tragic. She wasn't even the most loved. But Anne of Cleves did what none of Henry VIII's other wives could. She outlived him. Not by fighting, not by fleeing, but by enduring quietly, intelligently, and with more dignity than the court around her ever gave her credit for. And maybe that's the lesson she leaves us. That survival isn't always glorious. That sometimes to live is to vanish. And that just because history forgets your name doesn't mean your story didn't matter. Anne of Cleves is often the wife no one remembers, but now you do. And if her quiet ending unsettled you, if the silence left ringing in your ears is somehow louder than any executioner's axe, then wait until you see what they did to Catherine Howard, because her death didn't come in silence, it came screaming. Click here to uncover the final moments of Henry's youngest queen and what she whispered before the blade fell.